All right, welcome everybody. I know you've all been waiting for this interview. I posted about it last week. I'm going to be interviewing two great authors today. One authored or co-authored this book, The Great Sex Rescue. It's I'll pronounce these as best I can, but you know I'm horrible at pronunciation. Sheila Gregoire, Rebecca Lindenbach, and Jonah Swaski. It's The Great Sex Rescue. So my wife and I read this book a couple months ago, and we loved it. It was very eye-opening. It put a lot of stuff to intuitions I had like a lot of words to the intuitions I thought I had. And I was like, I gotta like get this information out. So I thought it'd be great to bring on one of the authors and her husband on to talk about the book today. So let's welcome Sheila and Keith with us today. Welcome, you two. How are you guys doing?
Great. Thanks for having us.
Of course. Yes. I'm very happy to have you. I'm very happy with the book. I thought it was, as I said, I thought it was phenomenal. And I just want to get you on to talk about it, give some people an idea about this book and what's in it. So first, tell us a little bit about yourselves, and also tell us a little bit about this book. What's it about and why was it written?
Right. Okay. Well, we got to go back to 2008. I started mommy blogging. Everybody was doing that back then. So I was all like housework, organization, parenting, all the typical stuff. And I found the more I wrote about sex, the more my traffic grew. And so my blog To Love, Honor, and Vacuum slowly morphed into this sex place, which nobody grows up thinking, you know what I want to do with my life? I want to be the Christian sex lady. But I became that. In 2012, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex came out. That was my first big book. I was creating courses about sex, writing about sex. And I came to you one day, my husband, and I said, hey, hon.
I'm a pediatrician by my natural trade. And she comes and says, hey, you know, what do you think about like speaking on stage in front of hundreds and even thousands of people about like our marriage and our sex life and all these intimate details? And, you know, I mean, what guy wouldn't jump at that? So, you know, here we are. And we've actually just authored a book together now too, called The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex.
Yeah.
But I'm so proud of the work Sheila did on The Great Sex Rescue. I think it's totally changing the conversation. And I think it's a really needed book. So I'm so proud of her.
Yeah, because what happened was, so we're here we are. We're speaking at marriage conferences. We have a podcast out. We're doing all this stuff online. I've got a blog. I write every day, talk about sex, got courses on sex. And everyone kept having the same issues. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. And then it was a Friday afternoon, 2019, January. I had a migraine, didn't want to work. I was on Twitter and people were fighting about whether or not they needed love or respect. And they were referring to Emerson Eggerich's book, best-selling marriage book, Love and Respect. And I was trying to procrastinate. And I thought, I have that book in my closet. Why don't I just go read it? Because then that can count as work. And so I went and got the book and I turned to the sex chapter and I read the words. It was directed at women about what men need. And Emerson Eggerich said, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that set the stage for the whole chapter. There wasn't a single thing in that chapter about how women can feel pleasure. It was just that men need physical release. Women need to provide it. If you don't, he might have an affair. And I thought, oh my gosh, what if this is the reason that Christian women are having trouble with sex? And so that's what started our project for The Great Sex Rescue.
Right. And I just want to clarify for the audience, we're all adults here today. We're going to be talking about sex. If you're uncomfortable with that, just give you a heads up. We're going to be talking about that because the point of this interview is to point out that there has been a lot of problems in the way some Christian leaders have been teaching sex in the church, things they've been getting wrong. And so we're going to dive into more of that. So, for example, as you were talking about, you criticize a lot of Christian books on sex, like you mentioned, Love and Respect. And I honestly think that criticism is spot on. So let's talk a little bit more about Love and Respect. Because shortly after my wife and I were married, someone paid to send us to one of their conferences they were going around the country doing. And both my wife and I felt something was wrong, but we couldn't put words on it. Like we kind of left going like, okay, I think we ultimately ignored a lot of what was taught there. And instead we just did what we thought worked best for our marriage. Like if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. So what is the message of the book of Love and Respect? Elaborate just a little bit more in like 1 or 2 minutes. And then we'll move on from there.
Basically, what he's saying is that men need respect and women need love. And if you can just figure that out, your marriage will be fine. And so he separates love and respect and he defines what they both mean. So for instance, respect is conquest, hierarchy, authority, intuition, relationship, and sex. So that's what he needs, all those things. And so a lot of it is very much a hierarchical relationship. Now, where he got all of this was actually from a survey that Shanti Feldon did for her book For Women Only, where she asked men, would you rather be alone and unloved or inadequate and disrespected? And of something like 72% of men chose alone and unloved. They said they would rather be that. And so Shanti took that to mean that men prefer respect to love, because they don't want to be disrespected. Now, there are so many problems with that. First of all, any survey developer will tell you that's a double-barreled question. If they say alone and unloved, you don't know if they're reacting to the alone or the unloved or the inadequate or disrespected. You can't have a double-barreled question like that. But also, and more fundamentally, they never asked women. So you get 72% of men saying, yeah, you know, I don't want to feel disrespected. And they say that this is a gender difference, but they never ask women. And when subsequent researchers have asked women the exact same question, you get women saying the same thing in roughly the same numbers.
And it's not just this book. There's a lot of books that have been sort of teaching this idea in the Christian community that that basically men need sex and women need love. And that's the end of it. Like, like there's more. You mentioned a whole bunch in this book that I didn't even know. And I was like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah, because what we did was, you know, I had read Love and Respect. And up until then, even though I've been writing books, we've been speaking at marriage conferences, I've been blogging. I was even on Focus on the Family 3 times. So I was in that evangelical space, but I hadn't read the evangelical marriage books because I was always afraid of plagiarizing. And so I read this book and it was like a nuclear bomb in my living room.
I got to tell you, I was upstairs and I kept hearing from downstairs, oh my goodness. No, he didn't really say that. Like,
it was bad. It was bad. And so I'm working on my blog at the time was my daughter, Rebecca Lindenbach, who has a background in psychometrics or survey development, and Joanna Sawatsky, who had just graduated. She has a master's in epidemiology. She's a statistician, and she was home with her baby. And so we had this group of people with all different skill sets. And so we decided, why don't we just see what happens when people are taught this stuff? So we surveyed 20,000 women. It's the largest survey that's ever been done of evangelical women. We asked them marital satisfaction questions, sexual satisfaction questions, and then we presented them with a number of evangelical teachings about sex, asked if they had ever been taught them or believed them, so that we could compare women who did believe versus didn't believe certain things and see if that changed marital or sexual outcome variables.
So let's dive into this a little bit more. Let's talk about how these Christian books have sort of corrupting the view of sex and marriage and Christian relationships. Like a lot of books on sex, like I'm thinking of like Every Man's Battle, assume that men are basically Neanderthals with uncontrollable sexual desires, then they cannot be quelled. Yes. And if their wives do not, give sex to them, they're just going to have affairs. Now, in your book, this message is not only harmful to women, it's harmful to men. Can you explain how this is harmful to both?
Yeah, well, I'll go first and then maybe you can jump in with our newest research. But when you tell a guy that all men struggle with lust, has anybody ever heard of self-fulfilling prophecies? Like,
yeah,
like
exactly.
When you tell 12-year-old boys you are never going to be able to stop looking at women, I mean, it's a terrible thing to do. But even more fundamentally, we think what we've done is we've conflated lust with noticing that a woman is attractive. And then guys feel like they're sinning constantly. And so we found that the Every Man Struggle with Lust message is very dangerous to women in that it lowers marital satisfaction. It lowers their trust in their husbands, even if their husbands have not shown any hint of being dishonorable people. It lowers arousal levels. And it's the one that's most related to lowering women's libido. So it just kills women's libido. And interestingly enough, this is the one belief that we measured that has an effect, even if women never believed it, but if they were only taught it. So we think there's something about growing up in a community where all the guys around you believe that they lust all the time, that just kills libido in women. And then what we did more recently, since The Great Sex Rescue was out, we actually surveyed guys. And we asked them that question, whether they all struggle with lust.
Yeah, and that was what formed the basis of the chapter on lust in our book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex.
Mhm.
And what we found was we asked the question, do you personally have a struggle with lust? And we got a response rate of about 75% of men who reported that they had a daily struggle with lust, which in and of itself is an interesting finding because that is not every man. That's 75%. So 25% of men are like, yeah, no, I'm good. That was an interesting finding. But you know, what the mentality out there is going to be, people are going to say, well, 75% of men struggle with lust and the other 25% struggle with lying, because we just don't want to let this idea go that this is what all men do. We are Neanderthals. Like in these books, one of the books says men just don't have a Christian view of sex. The things they say about men, we have struggles with sexuality because of our maleness. I don't understand how we as men in the church allowed ourselves to be characterized in this way. And I don't think it's true of the vast majority of Christian men. So
well, I think you're.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Finish your thoughts. Sorry about that.
So what we did in the study was we actually gave men some scenarios. And we saw, do they actually lust in these scenarios? So, and we took the scenarios out of some of these big Christian books. And then we said, in this situation, would you do the things that they say that men all do? And then we sort of looked at what percentage of men do that. And a very, very large percentage of men who report having a daily struggle with lust don't show any evidence of lusting in any of the scenarios that we provided for them. And so our conclusion was that these men are feeling guilty about being men attracted to women, basically, because we've conflated those two things in the church.
Yeah.
Right. And I think you guys have done really good work differentiating between lust and attraction. I mean, that is you're absolutely right. That is something we have conflated in the church, and it has been wrong. And it's also ignoring the teachings of Jesus, for example. He doesn't tell, like, a lot of when the message in the church is like, well, women need to dress more modestly to help men. But that's not what Jesus ever says. He says, don't commit lust in your heart. You know, you're supposed to, men are so expected to not be lustful and to work on their own character, work on their own virtues, to start to exemplify that, not just assume they're bound by this determined Neanderthal-like nature that they can never control. So I really liked how you put that in the book. But let's move on to the next side. Let's talk about another aspect that you talk about in this book, how the teachings in the church are affecting women. So like one thing, let's talk about this blaming women for always being immodest. Why do you think the church is doing this? Like, it just seems like I grew up with this mentality. Like my mother was constantly belittled by other women in the church because she was an aerobics instructor. So sometimes she would wear, like yoga pants. She taught aerobics in like the gymnasium at the church, and other women would get mad at her because, she's showing too much.
Right. Well, if you believe that all men struggle with lust and they can't help it, which is what book series like Every Man's Battle says, then the only way to stop guys from lusting is for women to take up the burden. And women do that in two ways. They either cover up so that men can't be tempted and they're not stumbling blocks, or they have so much sex that he won't be tempted. And both of those things are heavily taught in our Christian books. The covering up thing is just ridiculous because, stumbling block, modesty, all of that is very subjective. And Jesus never put the blame, just like you said, he didn't put the blame on women. He said, whoever looks at a woman with lust. So that is a deliberate action combined with a deliberate mindset. That's the problem. And the way that you fight lust, and multiple studies have found this, not just ours, but the best way to fight lust is to treat women like whole people. So stop seeing women as a collection of body parts. And both men and women tend to do that with women far more than we do with men. We tend to see each other as body parts, but we can learn how to see each other as whole people. And that's what Jesus did. Jesus never refused to look at a woman. Jesus chose to truly see women. And that's the big difference. In Every Man's Battle, they tell guys, you need to bounce your eyes. If you go into an office and there's a receptionist in front of you, you need to turn away from the receptionist. So you need to constantly avoid women. Jesus did not avoid women. And when you think that you have to bounce your eyes or that you have to avoid her, you are still treating her like a sex object.
Exactly.
That is no different. You're just simply trying to erase her, but you're transferring your shame onto her. So now she feels like there's something wrong with me because he can't look at me.
Exactly. And I like the way you put that. That is absolutely right. It teaches men that the women are just sex objects, and you have to avoid sex objects because they're going to tempt you. And you're a slave to your desires. But so we've talked a little bit about how this hurts men, but let's talk a little bit more about the other aspect in this book, how it hurts the women. You have a really good quote in this book that like hit me deep. And I'll just read it directly. It says, "Which message have you heard more often in churches, studies, or Christian books? Do not deprive your husband, or women's sexual pleasure matters." Now, so either or. So that's the mentality, of course, I was raised with. Now, when I read this in your book, it almost felt dirty hearing the second one. Like, yes, I would. If I heard a sermon titled "Women's Sexual Pleasure Matters," I would be like, "Oh, this doesn't sound right." But it's true. This does matter, and no one talks about it. Women in marriages are just treated like you're an object there to satisfy your husband's sexual urges so he doesn't cheat. That's all that matters. But no one ever talks about how women desire sexual pleasure. They need sexual pleasure, and it's a good thing, and that should be encouraged. So please expand upon that and talk more about this.
Okay. I think it gets back to the definition of sex, because this is pretty important. So if I were to say, did you have sex last night? Which I'm not going to ask because that's gross. But if I were to ask that, everyone gets this picture of what I'm asking, which is something like, did he put his penis into her vagina? Like, we're picturing intercourse. And that's what we think sex is. The problem is that she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head. She could be in emotional turmoil, or she could even be being coerced. And that would still count as having sex. And biblically, that's not what sex is. I know in the Great Sex Rescue, I think I gave like 7 different P words that explained what sex is supposed to be, personal, pure, pleasurable, etc. But I'll give just 3 for people to remember, because people can remember 3 things. Okay. Genesis 4, verse 1. Adam knew his wife Eve, and they conceived a son. And we laugh at that verse like, okay, God's just embarrassed of saying the real thing that they did there. But the Hebrew root for the word to know in that verse is the same as when David says, "Search me and know me, O God." God is saying that sex is not just physical. It's this intimate longing to be connected. So sex is intimate. We know from Song of Solomon that sex is pleasurable for both. And then we know from 1 Corinthians 7 that it is mutual. Everything that he has, she has too, and vice versa. So in the Bible, sex is something which is mutual, pleasurable for both, and intimate. If that's what sex is, then we need to realize that many women are being deprived, even if sex is happening, or even if intercourse is happening frequently. Because if she feels used after sex, and I think 19% of our survey respondents said that was their primary emotion after sex. If she feels emotionally distant during sex, or if she's even not receiving any pleasure, then she is already being deprived. And yet we're constantly talking about how women have to not deprive their husbands of intercourse. And we very, very rarely, I think it was 95% to 5% as to which message women hear more often. We very, very rarely talk about the fact that women's experience matters too.
Yeah, and I liked in your book, you talked about reasoning from the book, Every Man's Battle. Like, women come away from that book feeling guilty. Like, well, I got to give him sex or else he's going to cheat and it's going to be horrible. And that's their mentality going in. It's not about them or what they can get out of it. It's what they have to give. And it deprives them of something that God instilled in them. It's beautiful and they should enjoy it. That is something Christians need to say out loud. And that's why I'm saying it out loud, because this is something we have failed on. We have failed to put women in an important spot in this situation where their sexual pleasure matters. What they think about sex matters as well. And I love how you address this in the book very deeply. So anything else you want to say on that? Why do you think the church, for example, has failed to do this for women?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. We tried to answer that at the end of the book. I think there's 2 reasons. One is that in many ways, the evangelical church is very committed to a male hierarchy in some way, kind of the way Emerson Eggerichs was talking about it. But if we're going to put men above women, there has to be a reason. And so we have to see men and women as fundamentally different. Like we can't talk about them as having any kind of overlap, because then the reason for putting male in leadership falls apart. So we tend to emphasize gender differences. So men need sex, women need affection. You know, men want sex, women want to cuddle. Men are visual, women are emotional. And
first of all, just to interrupt you, I like to cuddle. Like, and like as a man, why would I want affection? Like, why? You're right. It's overlap. It's got to be both.
Yeah, exactly. And there is so much overlap. And even the idea that it's always the guy with the higher sex drive. I mean, 58% of marriages, yes, but 19% she does, 23% it's shared. So it is far more nuanced than we talk about. So I think that's one reason. The other reason is that I think that there are a lot of people who do not have very emotionally rich marriages or emotionally healthy lives. And so their measure for what counts as success is really shallow. When you look at all of the teachings that we measured in the Great Sex Rescue, so all of the teachings that hurt sex and marriage for women, they have one thing in common, which is that they do tend to increase the frequency that she will have sex slightly. So if your only measure for a good sex life is how often she will give him intercourse, these teachings actually work. If your measure is, do we have an intimate, close marriage? Do we both have sexual satisfaction? Then the teachings don't work.
Well, they fail miserably.
Yeah.
And just to give you like a cool little fact I want to throw out there, and go back to like Genesis 2, for example. Adam and Eve are like both priests in the garden. Like the garden is like the first temple, as a lot of scholars have noted. And when it says, you know, Adam needs a helper, Robert Alter notes that word for helper is really kind of strange. It typically refers to someone helping with like being a military sustainer. Like it's like there's a partnership there. Both matter. Both are important in God's Eden design, that they both had to be there. So it's not like this idea that, you know, the man was just supposed to be there and the woman was just supposed to be a helper. She was very vital in that situation. So back to the book. How has this book been received? Have you got a lot of good feedback? Has it been helping a lot of people? Has there been pushback? How has it been going?
It's funny. It's the book that has been selling really well over the last year that no one is talking about. Like we've been selling so well, but we haven't been covered in the major Christian media. I've been on a ton of podcasts, which is great. But the book has been selling really well, but people won't talk about it because we're specifically calling out some pretty big names. So people love it. Counselors love it. There's a lot of educators who are using it in their university classes. I've been zooming in on some university classes and counseling classes and talking about the book, which has been fun. And we get emails all the time. If anyone wants to see, just go to Amazon, type in The Great Sex Rescue, and click on reviews. There's 1,200 odd there, and they're amazing.
And click purchase.
Yes, do that as well. But if you want to read the reviews first to prove it, like it's pretty amazing what people are saying. The most common word I think is validating. Like I've always known intrinsically that this was wrong, what I've been taught, but I've never been allowed to say it until I read the book. So that's been really neat. So people have loved it. The powers that be have not. So we've had a lot of people threaten to sue us behind the scenes, blacklisting from conferences, things like that. Yeah.
Well, let everyone who's watching share this out so that the elites can no longer hide. So let's get this message out so that the Christian community knows about it. Because I thought the exact same thing. I saw a lot of it on podcasts and whatnot, but just like the larger Christian community that is more established has not been talking about it. And so I was like, having you on this channel, I thought would be a great way to get that out. So everyone who's watching, we're going to take some questions from live chats. So get your super chats in now. If you have any questions for them, go ahead and start putting them in. I'm going to ask them one more question, and then we'll start taking super chats if there are any that come in. So do you have any upcoming projects you're working on you'd like to promote? Is there anything you're working on that you want to plug? Go for it.
Yeah, so The Great Sex Rescue was really the book that said, look, evangelical church, here's the things that you are teaching that are hurting people. But then what we wanted to do was we wanted to write some books that said, if we were going to do this healthy from the ground up, what would you do? And so we wrote The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex.
Yeah. So, and Sheila and I wrote that together. And it was meant to be a companion to The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, which Sheila wrote 10 years ago.
Yep.
And to complement that one. But the thing I was going to say that relates to what you said earlier is that we in the church have taught a lot about sex being like physical and for guys, and women don't want sex. They just want emotional stuff. I think that the point of this book, Good Guy's Guide, is that, you know what, men are emotional and spiritual creatures too. And when we start saying men are like this and women are like that, we miss out on the whole of what God meant sex and sexuality to be. And so basically we're trying to start from the ground up, forget all the nonsense we've been taught in other books, and just from a Christian ethos, how would we build a healthy view of sexuality that honors the way that God made us?
Yeah.
And that's what the point of the book is.
And it's also awfully educational. Like, here's what the sexual response cycle is. Because if you get that, maybe we can finally bridge the orgasm gap.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, and I think I said at the beginning, I'm a physician too. So we have a lot of medical stuff in there about, contraception, family planning, the sexual response cycle, that kind of stuff too. So we hope it's going to be very practical as well as philosophically engaging. So.
Good. That sounds great. Okay, so again, if you guys have any questions, you can start putting them in the chat, and I'll bring them up, and we'll do that for a little bit. Again, the book is the Great Sex Rescue. I highly recommend it, and I recommend the upcoming projects you guys are working on. So here's one super chat if you guys want to comment on this at all. So God made sex to be a union between man and woman in marriage, and is a result of love. Waiting for marriage is prioritizing emotional and spiritual. So you guys want to comment on that or anything? Go for it.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so. One of the benefits of waiting for marriage is that you need to work on the emotional and spiritual side of your relationship, which helps you recognize red flags a little bit easier and make sure that this is actually a good match. So for sure. And also, if sex is going to be this spiritual oneness, you need to be able to be vulnerable with each other. You can't be vulnerable with someone that you can't trust. And that's why you need that commitment. That's why I think marriage is so important. And that's why God made marriage the place for sex. I do want to say one thing though about this, which is kind of interesting. We measured people who had only ever had sex with each other. And then we looked at the rates of sexual pain that women can experience, because evangelical women do experience vaginismus or sexual pain at twice the rate of the general population. About 22.6% of evangelical women experience vaginismus, 7% to the point where penetration is impossible. So this is something that pelvic floor physiotherapists, for instance, are very interested in. What we found is that if you have sex before you're married, you have a 25% lower chance of vaginismus. We're not arguing that people should have sex before marriage, but we are arguing that the way that we do the honeymoon and the way that we prepare people for sex is really wrong because we're rushing for sex at the end of the longest day of her life when there's the big obligation feeling like I have to do this, I don't have a choice. And it often doesn't work very well. And so let's start teaching couples, hey, aim for to be comfortable naked together first. Then aim for her arousal, because if you figure that out, everything will be better. And then intercourse after that. Some people do that in one night. Some people it takes like a week or a few weeks. Doesn't matter. Do it in that order. Things will be a lot better.
You waited this long. You wait a little longer to get it right.
Yeah, get it right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of pressure on the woman on the wedding night, and it doesn't need to be there. Yeah, again, so yeah, we're really well put. Are you guys interested in some more spicy questions?
I answer anything. I don't care.
All right, here's a question we just got in the super chat.
What do you think of self? I think it's a disgrace to your future. Okay, so we're talking about masturbation. Oh gosh, this one is a really tricky one. Jesus did say that lust was wrong. And especially today, masturbation is usually accompanied by pornography use, and porn is just simply wrong. No ifs, ands, or buts. Porn is the biggest driver of sex trafficking. You are masturbating to people being abused. So porn is obviously wrong. Masturbation when you're single, I think that if we can take that energy and use it in something else, that's likely a better thing. Just keep yourself busy, volunteer lots, know when your big times are to struggle and figure something else to do. It's probably healthier.
Okay, awesome. Okay, perfect. All right, let's pull up another question. Now, I think I already know the answer to this, but go ahead and answer this one for us. Is Sheila against prostitution from a biblical perspective?
from a Bible? I don't even know what that question means. Can you just be against prostitution, period?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yes, of course. Yeah.
Sex is mutual, intimate, pleasurable for both. Prostitution does not come into any of those three things.
Exactly. Someone's putting up a super chat came in Romans 1:24, which just says, therefore God gave them up in their lust of their hearts to impurity, to do the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. So just throwing a super chat up there. Not sure what it means. If you guys want to comment, you don't have to.
I think actually God has given the evangelical church up to its lust because we haven't treated lust properly. So
yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
In Paul's letters, he says repeatedly, put lust to death. That should be our message around lust, not let's just believe that every man struggles and can't get over it.
Okay, next question here. This is a question for Sheila. Since there is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit, is the Holy Spirit God the Mother? What?
I do research on sexuality. I do not do Hebrew studies.
Exactly. You don't have, again, any question you don't have to answer, and you never know what's going to come up in the live chat. But yeah, I do not think. If anybody wants more, I did a video a couple of years ago called Israel's Revolutionary Monotheism, where I argued that there was implications that they had monotheism very early on. It wasn't like an evolutionary process from polytheism. But in that video, I talk about how a lot of times in very early texts, like Deuteronomy 32, God is referred to in feminine and masculine ways. So he's talking about having birth pains. And so the scholar Trygve Medinger, here's his book, In Search of God, talks about this in his book. And he says this is evidence that God was considered genderless very early on. He was not a masculine deity. He was very much a genderless deity because they can talk about him in feminine, masculine terms. So, okay, with that, I don't see any other super chats that would address anything about this topic. Again, guys, let's try to keep things on topic. Like this one's not really on topic for that. So anything else you guys want to say before we close out? I appreciate you guys being here. Anything you want people to take away from this that's important?
Yeah, well, I think the one message that we found that was the most harmful that we haven't talked about yet is what we call the obligation sex message. So this is the idea that a woman is obligated to give her husband sex when he wants it. When women believed that before they were married, and 39% did, their chance of having vaginismus increased by almost the same statistical effect as abuse. There was only a 0.1% separating the two confidence intervals. So they were basically statistically the same. And what that says to me is that our bodies, women's bodies, literally interpret the obligation sex message as trauma. And so what we hear is, you don't matter. He has the right to use you however he wants. And that does not work out well. And yet over and over again, we looked at the 13 best-selling sex and marriage books in the evangelical church. We rated them on a 12-point rubric for healthy sexuality. And the obligation sex message was the one we scored the worst on as a group. None of the 13 books we looked at even said the word consent. They didn't even mention it. And a lot of them talked about marital rape and treated it like it wasn't a very big deal. So we need to do a lot of work on this because this is not of God. You know, if you look at the 1 Corinthians 7 passage, it's talking about this mutual, intimate, pleasurable relationship that is supposed to be completely for both of you. Everything he gets, she gets too. It isn't about someone saying, I have the right to use your body no matter what. And yet in our Christian resources, she's told, hey, postpartum period, that's a really difficult time for him. And so you need to give him a hand job. Yeah. Like Intended for Pleasure actually said that you need to make sure that he gets as much sexual release as he did before you were pregnant during the postpartum period.
I could not even imagine asking that after my wife had our daughter. Like that didn't even come up in my mind. Like,
yeah.
That's horrible to think.
And I think we as men can do a lot better than what we've been painted as in the past. And I think it's time for us to step up to the plate and say, no, that is not me. That is not the Jesus that I believe in. And we can do better. And I think we need to stop letting church leaders say things about us like we are uncontrollable Neanderthals. Like, you know, we just can't let that happen anymore.
Yep.
And that's why I'm really happy you're writing this other book, Keith. I think it's going to do a lot of good. I definitely think we should promote it and get it out there. If you guys have it, I have one more question that came in that I thought would be a good thing to talk about. So this question, what about being married to someone with no libido diagnosed by a doctor?
Okay. I have so much to say here.
Complicated question.
Let me try to do it quickly. If it is diagnosed by a doctor, I wonder what that means. Because if it means low hormone levels, that is something that you can look at and get treated with. So I'm not quite sure what they mean by diagnosed by a doctor, because the only way that a doctor could tell is by hormone levels.
Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. So
yeah. But can we take the doctor part aside for a minute, since I'm not quite sure. What if you're married to someone with no libido and your wife hates intercourse? First of all, figure out why. There's all kinds of reasons. One of the big things we found is that we often talk about frequency as being the big thing about sex, right? Like, let's make sure that sex is frequent. But when women have high marital satisfaction, when they feel emotionally close to their husbands during sex, when they frequently reach orgasm, when there is no porn use, and when there is no sexual dysfunction, frequency pretty much takes care of itself. It's very rare for a woman with all 5 of those things present to not want sex. So if she doesn't want sex, the question is which one of those things, or which of those things, because there could be multiples, is playing a role. And it doesn't mean it's his fault. That's the whole point of the Great Sex Rescue, is like, what we found is so many of these messages, when she internalizes them, then she doesn't want sex. Like, if you grow up hearing you're obligated, that kills your libido. If you grow up hearing that men are lust monsters, that kills your libido. And so it could just be the messages she was given about sex. And so you could have her read The Great Sex Rescue, talk to a counselor if you need to. She could be a victim of trauma. So she's got trauma in her past. That's a huge thing. Please see a trauma-informed licensed therapist. There's lots of evidence-based therapies that can help with that, because that's a huge issue. And then it also could just simply be that if you rushed through sex and it never felt very good for her and she felt used, she might have just given up on it. And so it might be one of those things where you need to go back to the beginning and say, you know what, let's just take intercourse off the table for the next 60 days. And we're only going to figure out your arousal. We're not going to worry about me. We're just going to figure out how your body works.
And I love the way you put it. All of that was absolutely perfect. And the only thing I can add is just remember, ultimately the core of your relationship is, how does this going to serve God? Sex is important, but ultimately God is more important. So take what Sheila said, apply it, and go from there. I'd highly recommend getting the book. So we did get one more super chat in, which I think. Oh, go ahead, continue.
I just saw a comment that I want to. Someone said if it weren't for lust, no one would get married. I want to push back on that a lot.
Do it.
Okay. It's not lust that makes us get married. It is love and attraction and desire. None of those things are sinful. To say that we get married out of a sinful impulse is part of the problem. Yeah. Because we are conflating sexual desire and attraction with a sin, and it's not. A drive for intimacy, which can be expressed sexually for sure, is not a sin. And when you love someone, you're naturally going to want to express that. And that's going to make you want to get married. But that isn't a sinful impulse. And so we need to make sure that we separate, sexual desire from lust. So lust is a desire to objectify and use someone for your own gratification, as opposed to a drive for intimacy.
Right. We need to differentiate attraction and lust. So, yes, we need to treat women like whole people. But my mind sometimes goes crazy when I see a beautiful woman. Men think differently when they see a naked woman than the other way around. Do you want to comment on this?
Sheila wants me to talk about a meta-analysis, which I don't know what she means. So I was just going to say, I don't know if this is a man or woman saying this. I suspect it's probably a man. And I would just say, give some thought to the idea that maybe you've been trained this way. Maybe the reason that you go crazy every time you see a woman, it's not necessarily the way that you are created by God to be, but it may be in the way you've been trained. When we tell boys from junior high that you are going to have this incredibly difficult struggle your whole life and you're never going to be able to defeat it. And moreover, we equate that with being a man. A man has a strong sex drive. Oh, and if you don't have a strong sex drive, you're not really a man. Then what we do is we feed this thing. So we think so in the church, we have come to equate male sexuality with the objectification of women. We need to unlearn that. We need to have a healthy male sexuality, which still sees the imago Dei in the woman. And that's going to take a lot of work because we've messed it up so badly. And I can't tell you in 30 seconds how to do that. But there's a lot of good stuff out there that if you look for it, how do I see women without objectifying them?
Yeah, that was really well put. I could not have said it better myself. So we have another question from a supporter here. We have, why has God created men with the strong desire of sex that brings them to lust and so often objectify women? Why women are not created with the same sex drive? Now, I think you kind of addressed this already to an extent, but go ahead and just address a little bit more.
I just do want to say how much of this is actually a social construct. If you look in the Middle Ages, it was assumed that women were the more sexual. And throughout history, it's gone back and forth. When the latest brain scans have shown that women are actually just as visual as men, all the meta-analyses, they've done these huge studies, they've combined all these different studies that have done MRI imaging, and it's actually a myth that men are more visual. It's just that women can discount the visual cues more. So we are just as visual, but because of social constructs, we don't tend to, it doesn't register in our brains. And so like our bodies will be aroused, but our brains won't be. So we have more arousal non-concordance than men do.
Interesting.
So it's not that guys were created to lust in a way that women weren't. It's that we live in a world where men are rewarded for lusting and told this is going to be inevitable, and women are told that they're not. We've just completed another survey where we asked women of all different ages about their experience as teenagers, and what we found is like younger women. So if you look at women under the age of 30, they have a much bigger problem with lust than older women did at the same age. Because if you think about how culture has changed, it's assumed that girls are going to be turned on by men now in a way that it wasn't when I was a girl. I didn't even know what six-pack abs were. I didn't know what a six-pack was when I was a teen. I didn't know until my teenager girls told me what a six-pack was. I had no idea because it just wasn't a thing. We were all into Tom Selleck's like hairy chest, I guess, but like even that wasn't a thing and so the way that we talk about sex has really changed our younger women's experience, and younger women are far more likely to have higher libidos than Gen X women are, for instance. And so a lot of this is the messaging that we're growing up with. Now there are, there's hormonal influences for sure, and it's not straightforward, but it isn't like it's black and white the way we often talk about it. Men are like this, women are like this, men lust, women don't. No, there's a lot of women who are porn addicts as well. There's women who have struggles with lust as well. And so we just can't paint it as men are like this, women are like this.
Here's another question. I've been traumatized to the point of being incapable of being attracted to women for all the wrong reasons, you could say. I have zero interest in porn. Should I do anything? Attraction equals persecution. Any comments on this?
I don't know what that means.
I don't know what attraction equals persecution means, but
I would simply say you need. I do not. I think he feels like he's being persecuted if he's not attracted because it feels like he's persecuting. He feels persecuted, perhaps. Honestly, I would say you probably need to see a psychiatrist, get therapy, talk to someone. If you've gone through trauma, see an expert in trauma. You can't do this alone. Yeah, absolutely. See an expert on this. You don't do this by yourself. Yeah. Here's another question. I'm not sure if I understand this one entirely, but if you don't want to answer it, you guys, there's no obligation. The church fathers emphasized multiple times that one should not give stumbling blocks before others. Well, duh. If you give someone a near occasion of sin, you are sinning yourself.
Okay, so the argument that they're using here is that women, I assume, is it about how women shouldn't be stumbling blocks? Okay, possibly. When my daughter was 11. My youngest daughter was 11. She was told by her Sunday school teacher that she had to be careful now not to wear V-necks to church now that her chest was developing because she might become a stumbling block to the men at church. Okay, in that scenario, who is the stumbling block? Is it my 11-year-old daughter who was so freaked out she wouldn't go to church for a month afterwards? Or is it the adult men who are telling an 11-year-old girl that she is an object of lust?
That makes me angry just hearing.
When you look at the stumbling block arguments in Romans 8, and where is it? 1 Corinthians 7, I believe. No, that's not 1 Corinthians 7. It's Romans 8. And anyway, when you look at them, what you'll see is that it's not about causing someone to sin as much as it is weakening someone's faith, that you're not supposed to weaken someone's faith. What we have found is that the modesty messages, when given to girls, do such profound damage to those girls. There is no message you give to a teenage girl that is as damaging to her self-esteem, to her future marriage, to her this is all coming out in a book next year. It's not published yet, but these messages are the most damaging. I cannot say this enough. And we are giving them to 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old girls. We're telling them you are responsible for a man's sin against you. Who is the one stumbling there? The adult man who can't look at a 12-year-old girl, or the 12-year-old girl who is made to feel like she is a threat, like there's something wrong with her.
Just because she's developing into a woman, right?
Could you pick up that mic and drop it for us? Like a nice little mic drop, you know?
The other thing I would add, too, is that this is a lot of guys say this. Okay, yeah, I know I need to control my thought life, but women make it so hard by the way they dress. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, we need to preach to women to dress more modestly. Well, here's my thought for you. If you could get to the point where every single Christian woman in the entire world dressed in a way that no man could ever possibly lust after her, okay, you still got everyone outside of the church. So you still got to get your stuff together, my friend, my brother. You still got to work on this. So stop preaching at women and start picking up your side of it.
Yep.
That's what I would say, especially since we know that preaching to women about it is hurting our sisters. It's hurting our sisters. So we have to stop.
Yeah. I'd also say too, you know what? In 1 Timothy 2, when Paul is talking about modesty, he was referring to wealth.
Yeah.
Because the concern was that poor people were feeling excluded from church. So he was telling the women not to wear expensive stuff and expensive hairstyles. And yet we have taken this to mean entirely about clothing. When's the last time anyone said, don't drive your Jaguar to church?
No, yeah, that's a good point. And you know, honestly, it doesn't look good. It doesn't set a good image. I don't think I would feel guilty as working in ministry owning a Jaguar, honestly. You know. So here's another short question. I mean, I think the answer is pretty obviously. Is there evidence to show that the porn industry is rife with sex trafficking? Yes. Where do I go to find some of this?
Just Google it. It's everywhere. Even so-called consensual porn is not really consensual. Most of the women who are on there are victims of sexual assault themselves. And it's largely, you know, if someone is acting out a trauma response, is that really consensual? And just look at all the stuff around Pornhub, how women had to fight to get videos of their own rapes taken down. There is so much to argue about what consent really means. And I would just say, if you are using porn, you're masturbating to someone being raped. And even if that particular person isn't being raped, the porn that you watch, the stuff that becomes the stuff that people ask or people get other girls to do to them. So you're creating a demand for stuff that will be asked to do in abusive situations. And so you just got to stop it.
So I just want to end on this point. We have to remember the world does not have the right message on sex either. The Bible does. But because the church has not been giving the right message on sex, people go to the world and they use things like porn. They live in abusive relationships. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not saying this always happens, but when we don't teach the right message, people leave the church and they go somewhere else to find it. So we need to get this right. And that's why I wanted to bring both of you on to talk about this book, because this is very, very important stuff. And it is a big stumbling block for people. So thank you both for coming on. I appreciate this interview. I encourage everyone to get the book, The Great Sex Rescue. Remind me the names of the other books, because I'm really bad at remembering names, the ones that are coming out.
So The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex and the all-new Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex drop on March 15th. And you can find me on the Bare Marriage podcast. Keith and I are often there together, along with Rebecca Lindenbach, my co-author, or just at toLoveHonorAndVacuum.com, my blog.
Awesome. And thank you for coming. Appreciate it. And everyone, remember, go get the book, follow these two, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks.